Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 17. Time skip. Ever since his mental breakdown, Izuku had been avoiding Shinso. He was embarrassed, and the whole thing clearly made Shinso uncomfortable because he was also giving him a wide berth. They would nod or wave and exchange the customary pleasantries, but it was all performative and surface level. It was probably for the best. Izuku was a complete mess of a person, even if he wasn't a null. Shinso shouldn't get himself caught up in all of Izuku's problems. He could put on a show and act as normal as he could, but he knew he wasn't. Normal people didn't eject their consciousness out of their body at the slightest inconvenience. Normal people didn't wake up from nightmares screaming. Normal people didn't have an empty pit in their stomach that they occasionally fall into and lose themselves for weeks at a time. And normal people don't put on a little costume every night and become a completely different person. No, it was better for Shinso to stay far away from him. Maybe his mom warned him that Izuku was crazy. Maybe she could feel it, and maybe that's why she couldn't feel anything else, and she finally figured it out when he had his little meltdown. He knew he shouldn't have come into the library like that. He knew it was only a matter of time before Shinso decided he didn't want anything to do with him, but he was hoping the reason he left would be the quirklessness, not just who Izuku was as a person. Izuku was gaining a lot of new skills because of his nightly escapades, one of them being knot tying. The better he got at this whole vigilante thing, the more criminals he apprehended, and he was getting really tired of having to strip them of their belts to tie them up to wait for their police chauffeur. They weren't even guaranteed to have a belt, and the first time Izuku ran into that problem, he decided to start carrying short lengths of rope to restrain them. Zip ties would have been easier, but there was plenty of rope washing up on the beach from fishermen, and zip ties were too easy to get out of anyway. Plus, Izuku took perverse joy in tying more complicated knots around the more violent or annoying criminals. It was very fun to watch them struggle with it from the rooftops if they woke up before the cops showed. So yeah, Izuku had learned how to tie a lot of different knots, and his work was becoming increasingly more absurd in its complexity. Another skill that was more to be expected was first aid. Izuku was no novice when it came to first aid. He had been tending to his own scrapes, bruises, and burns from bullies since he was old enough to open a Band-Aid. But street thugs hit harder than middle schoolers. Middle schoolers also didn't tend to have knives or the intent to kill. Izuku had never needed to use the sterile needle and thread that came with his quickly diminishing souped-up first aid kit, but well, there's a first time for everything, and necessity continued to be Izuku's most effective teacher. Izuku's skills were improving, but his supply was decreasing. He was going to need to start pickpocketing people before he called the cops again. Izuku was all for making do with what you've got, but that didn't apply to medical equipment. While he preferred to not get stabbed in the first place, he definitely preferred not rotting away from infection in the stairwell of an abandoned brick factory. Midoriya had been pulling away from him ever since he broke down crying a few months ago, and Hitoshi didn't know whether it was his fault or not. He'd asked what was wrong, and he'd been giving him his space ever since he brushed him off, but he didn't know what else to do. He seems to have gotten over whatever mood he'd been in, but he still barely talked to Hitoshi, and he couldn't figure out why. Was he mad he didn't tell him about his quirk? Kami, he was really smart. He probably knows what it is already based on his mom's quirk. Should he try to talk to him more? Was he just giving Hitoshi space because Hitoshi was giving him space? Was he just not the type of person to start a conversation? Looking back, Hitoshi realized most of their conversation started because Hitoshi had been curious about what he was researching, and today he had a handful of loose circuit boards held together by wires plugged into his laptop. That seemed like a reasonable thing to question. Maybe he should try again. Wait, if he had a laptop, why was he always here? Izuku was sick and tired of people not taking him seriously every time he opened his mouth. He could jump off a 2-story tall windowsill and knock a man unconscious, but the second he turned to his buddy and told them to drop their weapon, suddenly he wasn't a threat anymore. He could cover his face and act as skilled as a grown man, but he couldn't not sound like a kid, no matter how hard he tried. Sometimes people would think he was a woman instead, and if Izuku didn't already have supreme respect for women in heroics, he definitely did now. People took him more seriously when they thought he was a prepubescent boy than when they thought he was a woman. Kami people are stupid. Being whoever this was the only time Izuku ever got any respect, so when people underestimated him like that, he took immense joy in making them look like a fool. As fun as it was to play the girl boss card, when people thought he was a woman, he would rather them just take him seriously. Plus, his voice was just another way to identify him, so Izuku decided to dip his toes into the support items industry a bit. He had no shortage of loose wires and circuit boards from his scavenging at Dagobah, so he figured using the little free time he had, trying to make a voice modulator could be worthwhile. He spliced together a little toy megaphone with the much better quality speakers from one of those pocket-sized Bluetooth boomboxes. It took a lot of delicate soldering and even some programming that he had to do at the library. And boy, did he have his work cut out for him dodging Shinzo's questions about that. But he only mildly electrocuted his own face a few times before he got the hardware and the software to play nice and work properly. That was all well and good, but he still needed to make housing for it. It was just a loose pile of circuit boards and wires. He couldn't just shove that in a cloth mask and call it a day. He needed something that would dampen the volume of his actual voice so he didn't just sound like a child speaking with a man's voice overlaid. He needed it to have a hard exterior with a soft interior so that it would both muffle his actual voice and not cut into his skin. It needed to be tough enough to stand up to a punch to the face, but flexible and or fitted enough to move with him, and it needed to be breathable, but also needed to not let his real voice out. This was really hard. Izuku could see why people have to go to school for this. It took several months of working on it on and off until he produced something even mildly usable. This project alone required him to at least double the size of his scavenged little toolbox. He had used a thick aluminum sheet from the side of some sort of kitchen appliance for the exterior, and it took hours with a coping saw and metal files to get it smooth. He had to hammer it into shape, and he kept breaking his cinder block makeshift anvils. He had to turn the lower landing into a workshop. It was bigger, spanning the length of the first set of stairs, as well as the space directly beneath his middle landing. The only reason Izuku didn't set up camp there originally was that the floor was damp and it was full of old storage from when this place was still in business. But Izuku cleared that all out into the sub-level that he rarely entered. He soldered all the pieces together, which wasn't nearly as strong as actually welding it, but Izuku didn't have a welder, and if he did, he doubts his generator had the power to run that kind of thing. For the padding, he sewed several layers of cloth together, making sure the outermost layer was black, both to fit the theme and so it didn't show dirt as much. Sandwiching the mechanism between the shell and the inner lining was the last step, and he actually bought some Velcro strips to fit them together so that he could still access the inside for repairs if needed. It was clunky, and it was obvious that it wasn't his real voice. It was just a touch too robotic, but it worked. Izuku was starting to get to know the nighttime comings and goings of this town better than he had ever known the daytime schedules. He knew when the ladies standing on the corners tended to call it quits for the night, and he had taken to walking them home. He knew how skeezy men could be, and these ladies were nice. He didn't want them getting hurt. Even if catering to these men was generally in their job descriptions, they didn't deserve that. No one deserved that. He hadn't given anyone his name, so the ladies took to calling him Short Stack, which he didn't much appreciate, but it was done with a fond sort of teasing, and Izuku had definitely been called worse, so he let it slide. It was a bit strange that the people who he could most reasonably call his friends were hookers, but beggars can't be choosers, and they were nice to him. He would ask them about their non-work-related escapades, and they kept him updated on the latest gossip from their friend groups as well as the city. They would ask him about his work-related adventures, and he would regale them with highly embellished versions of his victories against the scourge of the town. Izuku had also become well acquainted with the homeless population. He continued to salvage any blankets or towels he found at Dagobah well past when he had completed his own nest, and he passed them out to anyone who looked like they could use one throughout the winter and early spring months. Izuku was lucky to have carved out a space for himself, but not everyone had that opportunity. He told them about some of the unoccupied warehouses far from his own, but not many took him up on it. He saw a few camps through the broken windows in his district, but there was no mass exodus. It was somewhere to go if it was raining, but there was no food to scavenge or passers-by to ask for spare change, so most of them stayed put. He learned that Shimamoto-san did in fact pass out day-old pastries to beggars at closing, and more than once Izuku let his sweet tooth make him a bit less selfish. Izuku let his sweet tooth make him a little bit selfish. They were delicious, and technically he was homeless too, so even if he was guaranteed at least one meal a day on weekdays, yeah, okay, maybe he should stop feeling bad and just take what he can get. Most of the homeless people around here dumpster dived behind restaurants and fished out any food that wasn't too far gone. So Izuku followed their lead most weekends. He looked around on weekdays too, but if he found anything, he would pass it on to someone who hadn't gotten to eat that day. They knew that he had their backs, and should he need it, they would have his. He had never had something like that. A community. Izuku had been avoiding the gangs and drug dealers as much as he could. He didn't want to bite off more than he could chew, but all the small-time criminals led back to them. They were one of the roots of the systemic issues that caused crime in the first place. The real root was the government and the unequal distribution of wealth and resources, but that seemed a little too nebulous for Izuku to target. He'd been stirring up a fuss. It wasn't going to be long before the gang leaders caught word of him, or he misstepped into one of their dealings himself. He couldn't avoid them forever. A gang was essentially a violently close-knit community, right? A stronger sense of community is just what this place needed anyway. Maybe he could get on their good side. If he kept rival criminals at bay, maybe in return, they could, not kill people and sell hard drugs as much. Yeah, that didn't seem likely. They were going to be on his tail sooner or later, so maybe he should start picking off lower hanging fruit. Show them he was a threat. He was a slippery little thing. He'd been at this for nearly half a year now, and no one had caught him. Sure, he'd gotten roughed up, but no one knew these streets like he did. He always got away in the end. As it stands, he was just cutting off one of the Hydra's heads each time he brought someone in. Every thug he stopped had two more replacing them because of that commie-forsaken gang. He needed to do something about it, or he was just going to keep chasing his own tail until he finally slipped up and got himself killed. So, Izuku did what he did best. He analyzed the opponent and found their weak spots. That gang had been running without opposition for a long time. Uptown wasn't patrolled by anyone, and it hadn't been for a number of years. They didn't know how to be stealthy, and Izuku used that to his advantage. He eavesdropped on every conversation he walked past, and gathered any information that the homeless or the ladies he walked home heard too. Izuku had eyes and ears everywhere. He organized small attacks on the lower-ranking members at random, and let slip any intel he'd gathered. If they didn't know where he was or when he would be there, they would have to assume he was always there, and if he knew all the things he said he knew, what did he know that he wasn't saying? As he learned more about the gang and its members, the higher up in the pecking order, he started to strike. He had to make sure they knew anyone was a target. One-man sting operations in and out before they even saw him. He climbed along the walls and dropped down like a damn gargoyle whenever he saw them, and he was out every single night, so that was pretty often. He built himself a reputation. There was no pattern to his routes. Every evening, he would roll a die, and each number correlated to a different spot in the city for him to patrol. He could be anywhere, so he was everywhere. Nothing scared people like the unknown, and nothing kept people in line like fear. It wasn't foolproof. If things really came to a head and they went after him, they would realize he was all bark and no bite. He couldn't really take them on, but it would work until they called his bluff. Hopefully he would be skilled enough, or he would have thinned down their numbers enough to take them on by that point. One night, when Izuku dropped down to walk the ladies home, they were all giggling to each other and looking at him. After a moment of whispers and non-discreet glances in his direction, Izuku cracked. "What? I've got something on my face? What's going on?" he asked with false confidence. This all felt a little too much like the girls at school for his liking. After some more whispers and elbow nudges, Iwai's-san looked at him with a smirk. "Oh, nothing. What about you, Ivy?" she said before falling into another bout of giggles. That did not clear anything up. "Ivy? Who's Ivy?" That just sent them all off laughing. "You short stack, you're Ivy." She took a break to laugh even more. "You'll never guess what Sakura overheard." "Somehow, I doubt whatever it is as funny as you're making it out to be." "What do you mean I'm Ivy?" he said, actually starting to get uncomfortable. Once Sakura got a hold of herself, fanning her eyes to try and keep the tears from ruining her mascara, even though it was the end of night. She spoke. One of those new low-time gang members you told us to keep an eye out for? He she cut herself off with another laugh. He was talking to one of his little gang buddies about you, and he said, I'm sick of just calling him that little mother trucker. It's getting confusing. She took another pause to laugh, and Izuku was starting to get a bit impatient, but he didn't let it show. Were they on to him? Were they finally going to come after him? Oh, Tommy, this was it. He's toast. He said, we got to give him a name. There's too many little mother truckers around here. And the other guy, ha! The other guy looks at him and says, we should call him Ivy. And when his buddy asks him why, he says, because he's green and always climbing up the walls and shit. Once she finally got her piece out, the whole group devolved into cackles. Okay, yeah, that was kind of funny. When the tension broke, he let himself laugh with them. He can imagine those two meatheads thinking real hard about what to call him, and yeah, that was pretty funny. Honestly, it wasn't a bad name either. Maybe the ladies would stop calling him Short Stack. Oh, Short Stack, you're making a name for yourself around here, one of them said once they composed themselves. Yeah, that was a long shot anyway. He'd been Short Stack to them for half a year at this point, and they liked to poke fun of him. He'd be Short Stack to them until the day he died. Hitoshi was convinced that Midoriya didn't want to be his friend. He had asked him about the project he was working on last month, and he just skirted around all his questions. No. Midoriya didn't want to talk to him. He was like 87% sure of that. He needed to stop stringing himself along. He should just talk to him and be 100% sure, just to get the heartache over with. He actually talked to his mom about it, and she agreed with him. He knows she went through the same kind of things he's going through before she found her own group of friends who accepted her how she was. She knew this cat and mouse game better than Hitoshi did. He knew what he had to do. He just didn't want to do it. He was being a coward again. He just had to ask. Just fumble their way through one more conversation and it would be over and done with. Midoriya was here today. He just had to do it. Hey, Midoriya, he finally choked out after 15 minutes of sitting in silence. Midoriya looked up at him, a little startled, before schooling his expression and raising an eyebrow, indicating for Hitoshi to go on. Great. He wasn't going to make this easy, was he? I was just wondering if... I mean, it's not like we ever talked that much, and it's not like you have to talk to me, but for a while, ever since, you, I mean, I could stop trying to talk to you. Do you want me just to leave you alone? Hitoshi elegantly forced out. Greenie was just staring at him. Midoriya? Hitoshi piped up before the awkward silence became corporeal and actually killed him. No, sorry, I don't want, you don't have to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you think that I didn't want to talk to you. I'm just, I thought that you didn't, after I broke down like a crazy person in the middle of a public library. He cut himself off, burying his blushing face in his hands. Hitoshi was gobsmacked. There was no better word for it. What the hell was going on? Did you think I was mad at you for crying? He finally responded incredulously. Still muffled from his face being in his hands, Midoriya responded, No, well, I don't know. I'm sorry. They were both idiots. Well, they established they both still wanted to talk to each other. Now what? Socially inept idiots. This was a bad idea. He shouldn't let himself get attached. It never ends well. It was different as Ivy. When he was Ivy, being mysterious was part of the brand. He didn't need to tell anyone anything about himself, and they didn't expect him to. He could keep people at arm's length, which was much closer than they usually want to get to Deku. Izuku didn't have anything to hide behind here with Shinso. He could only leave out details and skirt around the truth for so long before it became suspicious. And Shinso started asking too many questions. No, this was a bad idea. It was doomed to fail. He was just going to break his own heart again. Why was he doing this? So, did you want to be friends? He asked, finally pulling his face out of his hands to look at Shinso. Shinso's face lit up with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. Yep, this was going to end poorly. Yeah, let's be friends. It's been like, what, a year? We might as well. Izuku was a masochist. Using criminals' phones to call the cops wasn't always reliable. One time he kicked someone in the chest only to find out later that their phone was in their breast pocket and was completely busted. A couple of times he'd fish out their phone and it would be dead. And more than once he'd patted someone down to find absolutely nothing. Who doesn't carry a phone these days? Izuku had been pickpocketing every would-be rapist and murderer he took down. They didn't deserve that money anyhow. In order to fund his first aid kit and occasional food costs. Maybe he could cut back on a few things and pay for some minutes on a burner phone? He'd had to leave the scene to go borrow someone else's phone several times now, and it was really annoying to find someone he could convince to let him use their phone in the middle of the night in Uptown. He'd been going back and forth with himself on the issue, but when he took down 2 phoneless thugs in 1 week, he decided enough was enough, and he got a burner. The second time he used his burner phone to call the cops, he was transferred directly to someone called Sukachi? Detective Sukachi? Detective Sukachi was not happy with him. Something about nearly a year and vigilante and untraceable. Izuku didn't really listen. He was paying for minutes, so he just shouted the location over whatever the man was saying and hung up. Well, that was probably going to become an issue. End of chapter.